So as Kat Johnson said, we're here today to talk about micro-level data, data that has individual level data on people experiencing homelessness, and I'll add to that that you can use for policy and advocacy, and you can use to guide decision-making at the city level and also at the individual client level. And one way of doing the micro level is registry weeks. And so this next session is about registry weeks. And so what are they and why would I want to do one? But first, a bit of background. So we said our goal is to collect at individual level, micro level. We do have a registry week, which to date, Community Solutions has helped over 200 communities in the United States, Canada, and Australia to do registry weeks. So we've done it over 200 times. And we have a number of European cities, including Barcelona, Valencia, London, who have decided to do one this spring. And we're hoping Renault is going to join the ranks, so no pressure. And one of the things, we'll get into more detail, but the registry week, the process and the tool that you use is entirely up to you. So it's not a very strict, here's exactly how you do it. There's some guidance and then examples, and then it's really up for you, because you know your city best, you know your context better than we do, to customize it for your local context. So Registry Weeks came out of something called the 100,000 Homes, which was a campaign in the United States to permanently house 100,000 of our most chronic and vulnerable homeless people in just 4 years. It was a movement of 186 communities, so 186 communities that volunteered to work together to find those permanent homes. We selected a very specific population, chronic and vulnerable homeless, who were not well served through the existing system. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And we were a virtual campaign, meaning we never had more than 12 staff on the campaign, and we were working in 186 cities across the US. So a lot of our work was done online, through video, through online platforms. And it was a real-time bright spots campaign, meaning we had a way to identify what was working in one community and help other communities adapt it to their context. And in fact, we kept count of sort of the innovations during the campaign, and more than 80% of the innovations came from communities and not from campaign staff, which is lucky for us. And it was also a way to debrief failures or to learn from mistakes, or something that we call failing forward. And then it really was rooted in the scientific method, meaning we had in place a process for quality improvement and iteration. So trying something, learning, refining, throughout, rather than a strict evidence-based practice that you must comply with. So a little bit about the campaign. We had an independent evaluation done at the end of the campaign, and as you might suspect, we were able to house about 75,000 more people than would have happened without the campaign. So without the campaign, this independent third party said approximately 35,000 chronic and vulnerable people would have been placed. And with the campaign, or because of the campaign, an additional 75,000 people were placed. And to give you a little bit of context, this was not because there were 75,000 more housing units available. This campaign happened during the Great Recession that happened not just in the United States, but across the world. And so it was actually a time of reduced resources. And so it really became, how do you better use the resources that you do currently have, rather than building 100,000 new units. So I think that's very important to state. And then I also want to make sure to tell you that while we were focused on the most chronic and vulnerable, the independent third-party evaluation also showed that communities that participated in the campaign also did better in placing families and non-chronic individuals than communities that didn't participate in the campaign. So it wasn't that they were housing people chronic and vulnerable at the expense of non-chronic and families. It was the fact that they were improving their whole system, and that resulted in benefits for all populations. So I think that's really important for the European campaign, which really is about addressing street homelessness. And we really truly believe that by helping the system for street homeless people, you'll also be helping the system for families and others. So at the end of the campaign, we were able to house 105,000 people. So that was one of the probably happiest moments of my life. And it wasn't, always that way. There was a point when we were on track to be the 30,000 homes campaign. So that would have been really embarrassing. And so we really did have to really develop some interventions to really change that around. And one of the things that I want to go over a little bit is the diffusion of innovation. So for any innovation, for any change, for anything new, you can't expect that everybody is going to buy in right away. And in fact, in most innovations, follow this curve pretty closely. Approximately 2.5% are innovators, and they're willing to try something new just because it's new. So if we were to speak about the iPhone, those are the people that are waiting outside the Apple store before the iPhone even comes out. They just want it, they haven't even read the reviews, they know they want it. The next one is the early adopters, which is about 13.5%. They're very interested in that new thing, but want to hear a little bit more before they jump in. And then once they jump in, once you hit a tipping point of about 15%, using an innovation, you get the early majority on. So they like innovation, they like new things, but they want a little bit of proof and evidence before joining. And then when they join on, the late majority comes. So they need still more proof. And then finally there are the laggards, which is about 16% of the population. And they don't adopt changes unless they're really sort of forced or complied to. And I think of my parents who refused to get a mobile phone or a cell phone, and still have a landline, and still have a rotary phone. I don't know if they had them in Europe, that you have to dial. And it's not that people are just always in this category. It really depends on the innovation at hand. And so you might be an innovator for one thing and a laggard for other thing. On the European campaign, as our pilot group, we really are looking for the innovators. So we have 6 cities, and Brno is one of them, that we hope will take a little bit of leap with us, a leap in faith, to try what's worked in the United States and Canada and Australia, but to customize it for a European context. So there are 3 types of problems in the world, and so simple, like baking a cake. You follow the directions to the letter, and you get the desired result. Then there are more complicated things like flying to the moon. It's really difficult to figure out how, but if you do things right and you follow those things, you will get the desired result. Though you probably don't want me in charge of that project. But things like homelessness are complex challenges, and they're more akin to raising a child. So if the way you raised a child was to read a book on children and followed that to the letter, your child would not make it to a well-adjusted adulthood. You have to always be able to adapt and try new things and respond to the new situation and context. And so things like homelessness are a complex challenge, and you have to deal with them not from a technical standpoint, where here's what we do, but from a complex standpoint, where you use the scientific method to really test and refine things, but know in the beginning that no amount of planning will get you the desired result. So one of the learnings from our US campaign, and I think is almost my most important lesson, are three mindsets or ways of thinking that are incredibly important and form the foundation for tackling any complex problem such as homelessness. So the first is called cultivating a growth mindset. And there's been a lot of research, most of it done by a woman named Carol Dweck, about something called the power of yet. And the best example of that was in Chicago. There was a high school, a secondary school, and if you received a failing grade, normally in the United States you would get a big fat F, failure. But at this high school you got a not yet, which meant that you don't yet have the skills you needed, but you're not a failure. Your journey continues. And so there's now a lot of research that shows that when we change our mindset from one of failure to one of not yet, that we actually can do things that are more difficult, and that we can be resilient and stay at them even when the first time we don't succeed. And so I won't go over all of the examples here, but they did some scans of people's brains, people who had a fixed mindset, which means, yep, if I don't know how to do it now, if I'm not a natural, I won't be able to figure it out, and a group that had growth mindsets that really liked a challenge that they couldn't get the first time. And when you put them in front of something that's too difficult for them to solve right away, those with a fixed mindset show almost no brain activity, and those with a growth mindset show an incredible amount of activity. And so to tackle a complex challenge like homelessness, that growth mindset's really needed. None of us have it all figured out. No amount of planning can do it, and we sort of have to learn our way into it. Just some of the ways that you all and we can cultivate a growth mindset is to recognize it when you hear it in yourself or others. And I find myself doing this all the time. And so one of the easiest ways to do it is when you want to say, we can't do this, or we won't be able to do this, just add that term yet. So rather than saying, oh, I can't figure out how to get accurate data on homelessness, just say, I can't yet find out how to do this. That opens it up for a challenge that you can then, over time, succeed on. And then one of the most important things is that we're not praising innate abilities, like just that you're smart, but we're praising growth and improvement. Because we want people to be resilient in our work to end homelessness, and that doesn't happen if we're not praising that progress. And then, the scientific literature really does show that groups that believe they can change are able to change. So the second mindset is something called failing forward. And I think the best way to show this is, how many of you have a child? Raise your hand if you have a child or had a child. And the first time that child tried to walk, raise your hand if on that very first try that child was successful. Ooh, no one raised their hand. And what if after that we had said, yeah, you're not going to be a walker, you'll just crawl the rest of your life. And that's what we do, though, oftentimes for government and non-governmental organizations. We expect them to take something very complex and get it right the first time. And so instead, we have to embrace a mindset of failing forward. So I won't go over all of these, but I'll go over a few of them. If you're just going to fail, which I don't recommend, your motto is get it right the first time. If you're going to fail forward, you're going to be a little bit more of a scientist. You're going to test a hypothesis. I think this might work. I'm going to probably make one or more mistakes, so I'm going to fail, but fail quickly because I'm going to actually test it, and then I'm going to improve on that. If you're just going to fail on a complex challenge, your implementation protocol will be about, I'm going to follow a plan. I've got a plan, I'm going to follow it to the letter. If you're going to fail forward, you're going to have a hypothesis, you're going to iterate, so you're going to change and refine as needed. And you're going to chart a new course if that's called for. You're not going to have a plan, no matter how well written it is, dictate what you do if all evidence is saying you need to try something new. So, just the mindsets that I think is most important is that bias toward action. We are by our natures planners, and planning works really well for that simple challenge or even a difficult challenge when a plan, if you follow it to the letter, works. But with a complex challenge, it forces us not to do things. And so a bias toward action is necessary. And when I say that, I mean just start, despite outstanding research. So we never have all the data we would like in a complex challenge, but we still have to do something, despite unanswered questions. If you had all the answers, it wouldn't be a complex challenge. Believe that you can learn your way to a solution, and realize that whatever you do, whatever step you make, will get you in a better situation than where you are now. It may have been a failure, but you learned something that you can use the next time around. And so that's really the only way for us to tackle a complex challenge. And I don't want to sound like I'm being evangelical or trying to convince you of something, but we really truly believe that without those mindsets, none of us, no matter how well-intentioned, no matter how smart we are, can end homelessness. And I'm going to turn it over to Andi, who will now talk to you about Registry Weeks.
Thank you, Paul. So, as Paul mentioned, I'm going to speak a little bit about one of the interventions that we learned about during the 100,000 Homes campaign, which is called a Registry Week. And I just want to remind everyone in the room that this is one way that Community Solutions and all of the communities that we've worked with on ending homelessness have found as a mechanism for collecting and working from individual level actionable data from people who are experiencing homelessness in our communities. So, what exactly am I talking about? It's a kickoff or an acceleration event to end homelessness in your community. So perhaps you have all been doing a lot of work around this type of initiative already, or perhaps you can see a Registry Week as a way to get your community rallied around, beginning to address this current problem. As I mentioned, it's a proven intervention, so it's one that we were able to develop and test and refine during the 100,000 Homes campaign. And what it actually looks like is a week-long, community-driven effort during which we're learning every single person in our community who's experiencing homelessness by name. And we're collecting that actionable data, and we're also working on a plan for moving the people that we encounter during that week into housing. So, it's great to know what it is, but I do want to talk a little bit about why you might consider doing a Registry Week in your community. So, as Kat mentioned during her introduction, we have two types of measurement. We have the macro level measurement, we have the micro level measurement. So here we're focusing on a great way to collect that micro level data. And not only does it allow you to get data on the history and needs of people currently experiencing homelessness in your community, but we really stress that it should be a public event. This is the type of event that's going to increase attention to the work that you are all already doing in your community right now on ending homelessness. And within that, it offers an opportunity to involve everyone in the process of ending homelessness. So in a little while, I'll talk a bit about the people that you might want to invite into the fold or into the work that you're doing. It's very likely people who are already involved in the sector, but we'll also focus a little bit on who else you might want to invite into the process that maybe isn't currently active in it. So before I get into the details and the mechanics of the Registry Week, I want to talk about something that I like to call the surveying spectrum. And so on the one end of the surveying spectrum, we have what I'll refer to as a point-in-time count, or just a count. And this is an amazing way to understand the scope of the problem that's happening in your community. A count is something that will provide you with a snapshot of homelessness. Then we move towards a Registry Week. A Registry Week, in addition to understanding the scope of the problem, is going to give you the name and the details of people in your community who are experiencing homelessness, either on the street or in shelters or in precarious housing situations. Moving on from that is the Registry Week with a common assessment tool. So this assessment tool allows you to get the name and the details of the homeless people in your community, and it also provides a way for you to have some common data points that you can compare and contrast across your entire community. And then finally, a Registry Week with a good common assessment tool will do all of what I mentioned earlier, but it's also going to give you a method for prioritizing housing and services for people. So we're looking at a person's unique experience around homelessness, and we're realizing that there's a unique solution for that person based on the information that they're sharing with us. And not only do we recognize that there is a specific intervention for someone, but we're also looking at the services and the housing that's available in our community and figuring out what's most appropriate for that person. So here I like to use the example of an emergency room. In the United States, we have a process called triaging. So if you come into the emergency room and you have a cut on your finger, the service that you're going to receive from the people working in that room will look different than if you come in with a life-threatening illness, or with something like a heart attack, or something that seems to be a little bit more intense and requires more intensive services. So, I like to talk about Registry Weeks in two sort of chunks. The first is the planning. This is an event that does require a good amount of planning, and for people in the room who have worked on counts or have worked on censuses around homelessness, you definitely know that it takes a lot of effort to get something like this off the ground. So elements of the planning that we'll discuss a little bit of today are bringing together a leadership team. So that's you sitting down and thinking about the people that you're going to be working with very closely on the planning, the implementation, and then also the follow-up from the Registry Week. We're going to talk about determining the survey locations. So for the European campaign, for example, we're focusing on street homelessness. This will require mapping geographic areas in your city or in the area of your city that you want to focus on. And this is an activity that we'll be doing tomorrow for the people who will be joining us. Additionally, we're going to recruit volunteers. So I mentioned earlier that the Registry Week is meant to be a community-wide effort, and this includes asking people who don't necessarily work in the sector to volunteer and join us in our work. We found that using volunteers is not only a great way to maximize your resources, because you're not necessarily paying people to do this work, but you're asking them to join you and volunteer in the effort. But it also really, really allows people who have never interacted with someone experiencing homelessness to sit down, to talk to them, and to understand that they're people too, they have an individual struggle, and that it's our responsibility to help them work through that struggle to obtain stable and permanent housing. So I just mentioned housing. Part of the planning is also lining up your housing supply. So we'll get information on the people living on the streets or in our shelters, and we're definitely going to need to figure out what housing stock exists, what resources we already have, maybe what are some resources that we haven't thought about using for homelessness, and start to think about a way that we'll be able to take the information from the individual and match it with a resource that exists for them within our community. And as Paul mentioned, in the United States, for the 100,000 Homes campaign, this wasn't about building 100,000 new housing units. It was about looking at stock and resources that were in our community and maximizing the way that we are using them. And then finally, we'll have to secure both space and supplies for conducting our Registry Week. So those are the large, broad strokes of planning. And now we have the action. So I mentioned we're using volunteers, and I did say that we're specifically asking people who maybe have never worked in this sector before to join us. So we're going to have to train these volunteers. And I'll talk a little bit about what that training might look like in a couple slides. As you may have guessed, a very important component of the Registry Week will be the surveying. So using that common assessment tool to hit the streets, go into your shelters, pound the pavement, figure out who's outside, ask them questions to get their individual profile. Then we're going to do something around data entry. So Paul, in a couple minutes, will talk to you about the process around data that we have found that works best for Registry Week. But one thing that we find that's very, very special about this week is that we're collecting the data, and in real time, we're turning it around and sharing it with our community. So that happens over the course of a week. You'll sit down, you'll do a paper assessment with someone, and then within that week, you'll put it into the data system, you'll have the individual level data, and you'll also have aggregate statistics around homelessness in your community that you'll share with your community at large. That happens during the community debrief. So the community debrief is the culminating event of the Registry Week. It's the final thing that you will do as a part of this week, where you're sharing all of the data that you've collected during the week with people in your community. It creates a real sense of urgency around the problem. It allows people who maybe have some idea or no idea whatsoever about what homelessness looks like in your community to get a better understanding of what people are currently experiencing, people that we live next to every day. And so it's a very powerful component. And then finally, the real action, the real fun, the real rewarding part is housing people. Okay, that's great. You might be thinking, how am I ever going to do this? So the support that we offer is in the Registry Week toolkit. Paul and I will be handing out an electronic version of this on a jump drive to English speakers. I've also submitted it to Stefan, who will be translating it into Czech for people in the room that don't speak English. And it goes all the way from building your team, so thinking about who should I be working on this initiative with, through the community debrief, and touches upon each of the steps in the planning and implementation process. This is a toolkit that we at first developed at Community Solutions, but has grown more and more robust based on the work that all the communities have done that we've worked with. It's a living document. It's something that we readily welcome people to add to, and that actually makes it a much better tool for all the communities who are considering doing a Registry Week. So let's talk about a strong local team. We like to do this through the framework of something called collective impact. Collective impact is an idea that there's a group of important actors from all different sectors, so not just from the homelessness sector, that form a common agenda for solving a specific social problem. Paul talked earlier about these complex social problems, like the example he used, raising a child, or what we're here to talk about, homelessness. And collective impact is a great way to work on one of those complex social problems. So some guiding principles that we like to share around who might you want on your team are local stakeholders, so people in your community that are going to sit down with you. They want to demonstrate a willingness to share information. So what do we know about homelessness in our community from each individual perspective of the local stakeholder? And in addition to wanting to share information, they have to share a willingness to think about solutions. So it isn't just a problem, but it's a problem to be solved. We're also going to talk about combining resources. It's very likely that each group that comes to the table will have resources that you might not have access to yourself. And so in creating this collaborative, we're willing to share what we've got towards solving the problem. And we're also willing to share recognition. It's not just one person or one group or one sector that's going to solve our problems. And so the team will often include many of the same people that you might find on any strategic planning team. So it's incredibly likely that you've worked on a problem before in a collaborative effort. Of course, what we heard about earlier in the context of homelessness in Brno and doing the, I don't want to call it a count, but I can't remember the exact name that was shared with us. But doing that effort obviously takes a huge amount of planning and collaboration as well. And then we also want to talk about bringing some unusual suspects to the table. So people that maybe you've never thought about working with before in homelessness. Who might that be? Well, as you might not be surprised to find, housing partners, for example, elected officials, alliances around homelessness, outreach providers, so people who are sitting down on the day-to-day and talking with people experiencing homelessness in your community, people with lived experience, so someone who is currently homeless or was homeless will bring a unique perspective to your leadership team that's valuable and including when you're thinking about planning and implementing Registry Week. But also the business community. So maybe people that we think typically are very anti-homelessness, are interested in not having it be around for a variety of reasons, and maybe those reasons aren't the same as the reason that you want to end homelessness, but you're sharing a goal. Also, local law enforcement, at least in the United States, we found that police officers hold a great deal of knowledge about homelessness in a community, about where some people are located, about when they're accessing different service points, and maybe what their profile is, and so we would say inviting them into. But in addition to having this template of people that you might want to work with, your local knowledge will also help you decide who you would want to bring to your table when you're convening your leadership team. Now I want to talk to you about clarifying your demand. So when I talk about demand, I mean demand for a few things. First and foremost, your survey locations. So where is it that you're going to be doing your surveying? And again, this might be outside. The European campaign is focusing on ending street homelessness, but we've also found that in other communities, especially in Canada, for example, people are interested in surveying in shelters, in hospitals, in drop-in centers, or at other points in the sector where people who are experiencing homelessness might access some of our resources. We'll also talk about the demand for housing and resources in your community, which we will do by conducting that common assessment. So we want to know how many people are out there, and we want to know the type of resources that are going to help them solve their homelessness. And then the final demand is for the number of surveys that you're likely going to complete during your week. The number of surveys that you're going to complete will help you figure out the number of volunteers that you'll need to do this as well. So I mentioned earlier that part of the demand is figuring out the demand for housing and resources. And you're going to begin to understand the needs of people experiencing homelessness in your community by using a common assessment tool. So at Community Solutions and in hundreds of communities across Canada, Australia, and the United States, as well as other locations, we've been using something called the Vulnerability Index Service Prioritization Decision Assistance Tool. It's a mouthful, you may have heard of it before. We call it the VI SPDAT for short. It's a 7 to 10 minute pre-screen survey tool. And here I do want to say it's a decision assistance tool. So in absolutely no community that we've ever worked with has the VI SPDAT been the sole decider of how we're going to provide resources to people. It is a pre-screen, it's a starting point, and all other communities have used the VI SPDAT in addition to other surveys or other qualitative information collecting tools to allow us to create a profile of homelessness and then how we're going to get that person out of homelessness. It's comprised of 4 domains. So these domains ask about the history of housing and homelessness, about your socialization and daily functioning and wellness. And then it really helps us assess both the health and social needs of people in our community who are living on the streets. I also want to say here that the VI SPDAT is the best tool that we know. That being said, we definitely welcome other recommendations of tools that are working in communities, and if there's a better one, we would certainly want to use that too. So I'm referring to on this slide something called the Community Trends document. This is included in the Registry Week toolkit that I discussed minutes ago. And it's a way to help you use existing data in your community to understand the scope of homelessness. So I mentioned earlier that a great way to understand the scope of homelessness is through a point-in-time count. It'll also ask you to consider things like the number of shelter users, the number of rough sleepers, and other different categories of homelessness in your community. And then in addition to sitting down and filling out those data points, we would recommend that you include outreach workers and other frontline workers, like police, or people who are doing this work day to day to provide information to you on where you might find people. So this is a term that we call a hot spot, or a place where there might be a concentrated number of people experiencing homelessness. And then in addition to telling you where you might find them, these frontline workers also can give you an idea of how many people you might find in each location. So they're instrumental in this planning process. Now I want to talk about budgets and supplies. As Kat mentioned, part of the Registry Week and part of the question that we're answering here is how do we do all of this work for very little money and with no additional resources? And in the communities that I've worked with and in the communities that Paul's worked with, we've seen people do this with less than 1,000 US dollars all the way up to 18,000 US dollars. So it's a huge range. And there are sample budgets available in your toolkit, but I do want to pause and say that one way to keep your costs down is by asking for in-kind donations. So this has been a really, really powerful way for communities to be able to do a Registry Week for less than $1,000. And communities have asked people to sponsor all types of things. So everything from breakfast and dinner for the volunteers that you'll be using during your Registry Week, through the gift cards for survey participants. So when people respond to the survey, we like to recognize that they don't have to be doing this, and we want to thank them for their time. In the United States and Canada, this thank you has looked like giving them a gift card to a local restaurant or sort of a coffee house or something like that. And so we've asked for people to sponsor those. We've also asked for people to sponsor office supplies. So you're going to need things like pens and clipboards and flashlights to do your Registry Week. Potentially someone might want to sponsor printing of surveys and other materials, or even things like move-in kits. So it's one thing to identify a person that's experiencing homelessness and put them in a house, but a house should be a home. So we found that communities in the United States have asked for donations of furniture. They've asked for donations of things like rental assistance, so a security deposit, or actual rent payments. And within the toolkit, there are lists of all of these things that we've seen communities have asked for to help keep your costs down. So please do refer to that when you're thinking about planning. And then of course, we want to publicly thank your sponsors. They're stepping up to the plate, they're helping us with this work, but in thanking them publicly, it also gets other people, other groups in the community that maybe haven't sponsored something to think about, oh hey, maybe we want to join this effort as well. So I want to talk a little bit about lining up your supply. So just to remember that this Registry Week and the work that we're doing following the Registry Week is really about housing. It's about finding permanent and stable homes for the people in our community so that we're going to see those counts of homelessness decrease over time. And so immediately following your Registry Week, or immediately in the way that will work for your community, so to the best of your ability, you want to begin to house people off of that individual by name list. And one way that we've found that communities have done this is by not waiting until the Registry Week is over to line up your supply. So within the toolkit, there's something called a current system map. It'll help you compile a list of all the resources that you have available currently, and it can also help you think about the current resources that exist in your community and maybe think about ones that have not been specifically dedicated to homelessness, but that we could move around and use to get people off the streets. You can ask housing providers for commitments. So in places like Arizona and other areas in the United States, we use the Registry Week as a way to go to someone who's providing housing and say, we're doing this effort, and at the community debrief, we would love to announce that your housing provider has committed 50 of your housing units to housing people off the streets that we found during our Registry Week. It's a great way to get those housing providers on board. It allows them to be a very positive part of the process. And for you, it helps you secure commitments from the provider to know that the information for the people that you found during the week can then be translated into actual housing placements. We've also seen that it's really helpful to engage private landlords. So in the United States, we were typically going to people who were receiving funding for housing homeless people specifically. But communities started to think that maybe they would want to ask just the private market to participate. There are examples of letters that communities sent to private landlords in the Registry Week toolkit for you to refer to if you're interested in doing this. And then we also have something called an abundance index. And this is just a way to think about not scarcity in the community, but what we have a lot of that we could be using. And then thinking outside the box. So I did mention that engaging private landlords is a great way to do this, but maybe there are dollars in your community that are used to help populations receive housing that haven't been specifically set aside for homelessness, and potentially we could parlay that pool of funding or pool of resources into working specifically with homeless people. So moving on from lining up your supply, I want to talk about the volunteer training. Again, I mentioned that we'll be using volunteers. They're a huge and powerful component, but they're going to need some training. And so one thing that we've found that is very helpful is providing local context. So why are we doing this in our community? We had a great presentation earlier today that did provide that context, and it will help volunteers understand that there is a need in your community and that there is an effort going on in your community to end homelessness, but that we have to work on it together. You'll also want to give a little bit of information on a Registry Week. Again, this portion of today's presentation is specifically about a Registry Week. If you're finding that there are pieces of this that resonate with you that you would like to use in your community that aren't specifically in the context of a Registry Week, then you should also provide information on why you're going to be doing it this way. This will help volunteers feel connected to the work that they're doing. It will help them understand why we're doing it like this, and it will motivate them and catalyze them to go out on the streets feeling like they're a part of a fluid process from collecting the information to getting people into housing. And then a huge component, potentially the most important, is helping volunteers understand how they're going to conduct the assessment. So if you're using the VI SPDAT or if you're using another common assessment tool, it's very likely that volunteers have not worked with people experiencing homelessness before and have not asked this questionnaire. And so within the training, we'll want to go over the questionnaire in detail. And we'll also want to talk about how we're going to interact with people who are experiencing homelessness. This will include things like surveying do's and don'ts. It's very likely that your outreach workers have some of this protocol in mind, if not specifically written down, and so we'll want to share with volunteers what are some things that you can do that will help you have a positive interaction with someone, and what are some things that you actually shouldn't do when you're talking to a person experiencing homelessness. We'll want to review the consent form and introductory script. Paul will talk a little bit about that in the data portion of today. So we'll sit down with people, we'll ask them to participate in the survey, we'll tell them what we're going to do with their data, and we'll ask them to consent to this process. If a person doesn't consent, we won't collect any information on them that goes into the data system. Again, as I mentioned, we're going to want to review the survey question by question with the volunteers. I found in my experience, and also volunteers have found in their experience, that the more comfortable they are with the questions written in the questionnaire before they sit down with someone experiencing homelessness, the more environment of comfort they create when they're having that one-on-one conversation with someone. And so we actually, at the last point here, have volunteers practice the survey in pairs. You're going to want to carve out time for groups of 2 people to sit down and read the questions out loud to one another. And it may sound a little silly, but we have found that it's really extremely important for volunteers who are going to go out and sit down with people experiencing homelessness to have this experience before they do actually sit down and talk to someone. Within the volunteer training, there are some really important pieces of paperwork that you're going to want to have people sign. These are all in the toolkit, or at least templates for them that we've used in communities in the past. So each volunteer is going to sign an oath of confidentiality. You're having people ask personal information about someone. The personal information that's collected is going to be put into a data system, but it's also the volunteer's knowledge, and so we have to make sure that they know that they cannot share that information with anybody once they have collected it. You might also ask them to sign something like a media release form. Part of the registry week is having media attention on what we're doing, and potentially volunteers don't want to be included in that. So just make sure that if you're going to be taking photographs, if you're going to be doing interviews, if you're going to be filming any of the work that you're doing, that you have volunteers consent to being a part of this. And then finally, we also recommend a waiver and release form. So this is just by way of insurance. It acknowledges what the volunteer will be doing over the course of the week, and it says that that they waive their rights to suing you, basically, which I do want to pause and say here, we've never, ever, ever in all of our registry weeks, so over 200, had any volunteer ever be hurt. It's never been a problem, but it's for you to cover your insurance on your end. There are examples of these in the toolkit training section, so you can see what those templates look like that we've used in all of our communities. Okay. I covered a lot of information right there. The toolkit will be a great way for you to review that information. Paul and I are also here to answer your questions. And now I want to turn it over to Paul for a bit of a gut check.
Great, and we'll spend about 5 minutes also on questions. So first, raise your hand if you're thinking of doing a registry week for single adults on the street. Have some hands, okay. Raise your hand if you're thinking of doing a registry week for families on the street. Okay, we've got some hands. And who is thinking of including shelters and other locations for people as part of a registry week? So not just people living on the street, but others. Okay, we've got some hands up for that. Great. And so everything we've gone over so far is for all of those. And one thing I wanted to mention just about volunteers real quickly is volunteers form part of a team, and each team has a team leader, and that leader does have experience working in homelessness. So they're either an outreach worker or a social worker, someone who has extensive experience working with people experiencing homelessness. So no team is going off unprepared, and they've got a team leader. But wanted to spend about 5 minutes to see if there are any questions we can answer. And if they come in check, I think I might have Stefan help, or we can put on our earphones and try. Go to grab our earphones. Okay, any questions so far? Wow, no questions. It's all 100% clear. Yes?
I would like to ask about,
And I'll repeat what you say so that others can hear it.
okay. I would like to ask about the communities. Does it mean that you work with cities or towns or just, I don't know, blocks of flats?
Great, so the question was, what do we mean by community? Are those cities, towns, other levels of geographic areas? That is for you to decide. So generally we say it should be at the level that makes sense for you in your context. And if you can't do a whole city or community, you might just do a small part. So if you're only ready to pilot, you might decide to pilot where you know there's a concentration of people. And so in the United States, that's been as small as just a few blocks in the downtown area. And it's been as large as whole counties, which are numerous cities in a geographic area. So that's for you to decide what makes most sense. Yes?
So, how do you, or did you face the problem or the argument that you would basically attract new homeless people into the area you sold simply by either by just creating space for them on the street or by in a way attracting them through these services.
Great. So the question was, did you find, or was it a problem that you attracted new homeless people to your location just because you were doing a survey and people thought, ooh, we might get some help out of that? That is a very common concern. One of the questions on the VI SPDAT, that common assessment that we recommend, and if you use another assessment that we recommend, is that be one of the questions. Where are you from? Where are you living? Places like Los Angeles in California were really concerned about it, and the concern was mostly unfounded, meaning people weren't becoming homeless and moving to that city just because they were doing the effort. We do not know for sure that that would be the case in the Czech Republic, and one of the ways to deal against to tackle that is to do it Czech Republic-wide, so that every city is doing a registry week. And that's something that over time we're hoping the European campaign grows so that all cities feel, yes, we can tackle street homelessness and other forms of homelessness. Other question?
So when we did our gut check, I noticed a couple hands raised when we talked about doing a registry week, but I'm wondering if actually we could take a little bit of the time now to talk about reasons why folks think that they are not interested in doing one. So I flip it on its head and ask you the question this time.
So if you didn't raise your hand, what are some of the reasons why a registry week might not be the right choice for you or your community? Anyone want to tell us? And we're happy to talk over lunch or over drinks if you buy me a drink afterward. Great, so I think we'll go on then to the next section. Great, so we're now going to talk about everybody's favorite subject, data. I actually love data and think it is incredibly useful. And so during this session, we're going to cover the data system that Community Solutions has used and has developed for free, and that can give communities that want to do a registry week but who don't have a data system to support it, that we can give you. The process of moving data from a common assessment or a paper assessment to a database, and then talk about and show you some examples of dashboards and aggregate level statistics from the data, and then talk a little bit more about privacy and consent. So one of the things that we found in the United States and in Canada was that there was an interest for doing registry weeks, but that communities didn't have a database to have that data, and didn't have the money to build a database specifically for this. And so, we were told in the United States it would take 3 or 4 years, and we had a 4-year campaign, so we couldn't wait 4 years. So we found we could use Google Forms and Google Spreadsheets, which are free, so $0, 0 krona, €0. And that the Google Form and spreadsheets met both in the United States and Canada the regulations around privacy and protection of data. So they are secure data systems, though you would want to make sure that they work in your specific locality. And we found that throughout the world, lots of government agencies use Google. So we built a Google form and spreadsheet that automatically tabulates all of your data and shows that data in a form that you can use. One of the things that I think is different between a registry week and either traditional counts or that really comprehensive methodology that we heard from this morning in Brno is the immediacy of that data. So people are doing that registry week, they're doing the assessments the first few days of the week, and by the end of that week, they're presenting that data. So it is really as close to real-time data as possible. And in addition to data that you can use at the aggregate level for advocacy and public policy, you've got that individual level data on every person that's experienced homelessness. So if you're using the VI SPDAT, we customize the VI SPDAT for your context. So we were one of the co-creators of the VI SPDAT. We're working on a translation in Czech. There is one for the first version, and we're working on one for the second version. But so there are scored questions that are required in the VI SPDAT, but then your community, or in the case of Europe, Europe will determine some common questions and demographic information such as date of birth, male or female, length of time homeless, and situations around homelessness that you'll put in that meet your unique context. And then local communities add questions that are important to them. So for example, if you're interested to know in Brno whether someone's from the region around Brno, whether they're from the Czech Republic, whether they're from another European Union country, or whether they're from somewhere else entirely, you can add those questions. So if you use the VI SPDAT, that is your basis, but you add to that questions that you like. So just an example, in Google Forms, and we're going to try it today, but with the two languages and iffy Wi-Fi and internet, we thought it was just too dangerous to go over. But literally, the form is created in a matter of minutes. If you can type, you can create a Google form. And so it would have some things such as name, nickname, last name. We won't go over a whole form for you, but yes, if you are interested, we can provide you, at least in English, an English version, and if you provide us with a version in your language, with some help from you, we can put it into Google Forms and spreadsheets. And the great thing about the spreadsheets are the formulas are already in it, so that you can see the dashboards populate and the visualizations populate automatically, so you don't have to do anything but put the data in, and you'll see the aggregate results. As we mentioned, it is secure and it's password protected. If we create it for you, we don't own that data. You all will own it, and we don't have access to the individual level data because we don't need it. So it will be owned by your community. If you're part of the European campaign, Building and Social Housing Foundation will not own that data. They will have access to your aggregate level dashboards, but you will own the individual level data. And it is cloud-based. So it's pretty much common sense, but most communities do a paper-based assessment, though some communities have done on laptops or iPads or other devices an electronic form. You submit that data form. That data is then put in the database, and we'll help you tomorrow figure out how many data entry volunteers you need based on the size of your registry week to get that data quickly in there. The database scores the VI SPDAT or other assessment if you use it, and aggregates statistics. So just some examples of a dashboard for the VI SPDAT. Talks about the total number of surveys submitted, and then a tool like the VI SPDAT assesses for acuity or level of vulnerability. And in this case, 21% scored low acuity, meaning their service needs were pretty low, and they could be just referred to mainstream resources to regain housing. There are some that have moderate acuity, so here their needs are a bit more severe, that will need some intensive services and supports to get into housing, but likely won't need long-term supports. And then 30% had high acuity, so severely disabling conditions, probably mental health, health and substance use, maybe older adults who are going to require higher intensity services and supports in the long term. You'll also see visualizations like the age distribution. So here you'll see that 4.3% were over age 65. And let me see if I can make this work. One moment, please. We're going to try plan 2, my backup. Let me try plan 3. Can you try? It's not stupid. Stefan. Scott. Anyone? Oh, yes. Let's see. I'm working in 2 unfamiliar systems, the Czech language and Microsoft Windows. Well, I'd like to break off this and just yeah, that's fine. Oh, no, let me have it. It's just a slow. Can you shrink that? I don't need to see this. Thank you. So just to give you an example, and again, this data is, as you put in a new record, it updates automatically. Once the data is in the system, it automatically updates. Just to give you a sense of what you can see. So in this example, and this was from Ottawa. So Ottawa is a city in Canada, the capital of Canada, has a population that's almost the exact same as Brno. So 500,000 people. And it did a registry week of the whole city for 1,000 Canadian dollars, which is about 70 euros. So just sort of showing how inexpensive it can be to do a whole, and they did do their whole community block by block, and they also did the sheltered population. So some of the things that they found, for example, was that on average, people were homeless for 40 months, so that was important to know, and that on average, people had had 3 or more episodes during the previous 3 years. And we're running short on time, so I'm not going to go over all of these. We're doing okay? I've been told we're doing okay on time. Except for I can't hold this any two fingers down. Wow. Any idea how to do this? Just want to turn that a little bit so you can show me. Yeah, a little more. Okay. So, for example, you get, as we said, you'll get individual level data. So on every client that you served, you will have an individual profile, and then you also get the aggregate data. So in this case, in Ottawa, 63% of those surveyed met the definition of chronic homelessness, and that definition changes by country, but this was the Canadian definition. 5% were veterans, so people who had served in the armed forces. 7% were over 60. 63% had a serious medical condition. 85% had a mental health condition, so by far the vast majority. 83% had a chronic substance use condition. So were either active substance users or had ongoing issues with substances. 35% had recently been in jail and prison. 24% had been in foster care. So that means as a child did not have a parent and were in the foster care system. And 15% were Aboriginal, meaning Native people from Canada. So basically, the Google spreadsheets allows you to aggregate and do visualizations. Can you help me show a visualization? On any of the data, and you can collect data both individually and by subsets. So we could do that same information just on chronic, or that same information just with women, or that same, we're having trouble moving.
Come find me during the break and I'll show you.
Yes. We had practice on our Macs. We like Macs.
Thank you.
You can try to scroll it over. Okay, we'll just,
Find me during
they're beautiful visualizations. If you could see them, you would cry tears of joy. Okay, let me see if I can get back to the PowerPoint. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Ta-da! We're back. So we hear often that almost every community starts with, we would love to do this, but we've got very strict client confidentiality laws in my community or my country, and that it's just not possible. We have talked with FIANSA, which is the umbrella organization serving all of Europe around homelessness. And in fact, throughout Europe, with the correct consent form, meaning the client agrees to be interviewed and release this information, there is absolutely no problem doing a registry week. We do have sample forms for you, but these will always, of course, have to be looked over by hopefully a lawyer or someone who understands client confidentiality in your country, or probably even more specifically, your city. Because a lot of times, cities or other regions have added laws on top of any laws at the country level that you'll need to be aware of. So yes, it is a concern, and for no country in Europe is it something that there isn't a consent form for. And so there are other things that we do to ensure confidentiality. As Andy stated, you've got volunteers and people working in homelessness that are going to come across information. So each of them signs an oath of confidentiality, stating that they will not share that information with others. And then each survey respondent signs a consent form. We've also, in many cases in the United States, asked if we could take photographs of the clients. And that's a very, I think, delicate subject, and one for you to decide whether you want to or not. In the United States, we found that most people were willing to have their photos taken. That does help you follow up, because the registry week is not the end, it is the beginning. And it's great if I did the survey, but Andi is the outreach worker, and she can follow up the next day with Tom, because she has his picture, and she has all this information on him. So she doesn't have to start from scratch. She knows what he looks like, and she's got some information on him. And then, yeah, so we've got the samples, and we're happy to work with you if that is one of your issues or challenges in Brno or elsewhere. Happy to work with you and show you sort of the steps to make sure that you are both protecting the data and meeting any laws or regulations in your locality. So I'm not going to go over this because of time. So, we are actually ahead of schedule. We took out a lot of things because we assumed we were going to be so far behind. But I'm going to stop again for questions before we turn it over to Mark McPherson. So questions about data or confidentiality or databases? Don't be shy. Question from Andy. Andy's question was, does Brno currently have a database where they maintain client-level data on homelessness? Anyone know the answer? Anyone want to guess an answer? All right, well, so we'll try to find that out from Stefan. And as we said, yeah, we can provide a free database if Brno is interested but doesn't have a database. If you do have a database, we can help you customize it so that it can ask things. Yes?
There is no database at all, but there is like individual folder for each client.
Great, so that's very helpful. And that's where a lot of places started. And in Canada, really nobody had databases, and so they're using the Google form. And you know, we're talking about registry weeks, but I think I should also make it clear that that is just the start. We believe that the information on that registry week needs to be updated as people transition into permanent housing, so they come off the list. That's great. And as new people become homeless. And so in Canada and in the United States, they're using this as a living list to help guide the work and to do planning. So that is an option as well. Yes?
Could you mention like some of the issues which should be or have to be somehow some way of how to some legal issues in Canada which are tackling the database systems? Just for our imagination, what should be?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the United States, for example, during the 100,000 Homes campaign, Community Solutions held the data system, which meant that if we wanted to, we could see individual line-by-line data from any person in any community of the 186. In Canada, that has proven to be something that isn't acceptable for communities. So what we've done is we work with the community to create their own personal Google profile. We'll create the data system for them within that profile, and then we turn it over to them entirely. So I am using a temporary password to make the data system, the data entry form, and before the registry week occurs, they take me off of that data system and they become the owner of it, so that I will never ever see, as Community Solutions or just me, Andy, the individual data. And this is something that's new in the 20,000 Homes campaign, which is what's happening in Canada as opposed to what happened in the United States.
And in the United States, we did have a lot of places where sometimes, for example, the Department of Health or the Department of Mental Health said, oh, we don't want to share with others. And so it's often a challenge, but one that we can do, to get all of the players on board. Because yes, they can share information if the client allows it, but the individual agency or organization may not want to share with others. And so that is often something. So in San Diego, for example, at the start of the campaign, there were 3 registry weeks in San Diego, not shared, 3 different groups within San Diego doing different parts of the city. By the end of the campaign, we worked with them and they were all sharing data. Similarly, in Los Angeles County, I think there were 43 different databases and with Registry Week data, but by the end of the campaign, they had worked through the agreements so that they were sharing. And then this is done usually, and it'll depend on your locality, through a memorandum of understanding or other agreement saying that we will share data with these groups for this purposes. So it's similar to what the client signs, but is a more formal document between organizations. And so that's going to be important and is a step that you would want to take in Brno or other areas to make sure that all of you can see that. And I think Mark, when he talks, we'll talk about that a little. Now I'm putting you on. You now will. You will talk about this one because they figured it out in London.
One more question. What was the homeless people response that they will be in the database?
Yeah, so we've had anywhere between, I think, from 80% to like 96% of clients agree in their first time to be surveyed. Sometimes on the first day they don't, but then by the second or third they do. It really is helpful to have, an outreach worker or someone, a specialist on each team. I think that helps. I want Andy. Andy knows more about Canada than I do, so.
Yeah, so in Canada, it's about a 10% refusal rate, meaning that only 10% of the people we encounter say that they don't want to be interviewed or surveyed. And another thing too, and Paul mentioned this briefly, is that when we think about a registry week, like I said, it's a kickoff event. So the list that we're creating, this by name list of people, is meant to be one that's constantly updated. And this means from the client's perspective, they don't just have one chance to get on the list. So if they say no the first time, we would continue to ask them in an appropriate way if they would want to be surveyed. And if they say yes at any point, they can enter into that list as well. Yes. That would be you. Sorry, Beat. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, what do you mean by continually updated? Do you mean like every year or week, or how does it work? So it is not like too demanding for like. And the second question on the access of information. Who in the team should have access to like this individual level information? Who to this aggregate data? And so like, I guess like even though, for example, in Canada they kind of push to offer the access, and I guess like within the municipality and the social workers there were maybe some people with restricted access and some people with like full access over there.
Yeah, both are good questions. So
Both answer, or I can answer the first one. Sure. So the first question was about who has access to the data, and that is decided by the community. We recommend that you give aggregate access, meaning access to those dashboards, to anyone who is involved, and to media and others, and that you decide who else gets to see it. In the United States, over time, we developed some very sophisticated levels of access, granular access, so that you could only see the clients you worked with, or the clients of the people you supervise. But you likely won't start out that way. And a lot of places did what they called case conferencing, where they would go over the list, and because everybody was included on that consent form, go over the list and assign people clients. So there was a way of doing that. There was another part of your question, of that first question, that...
I remember.
What, can you remind me? I had something. What was it?
Oh, about
The first question. There's another part of the question. No, just there was a second part to that first question. Oh, updating. So updating depends on your community. If you've got a strong and existing street outreach team and shelters, anytime a new client comes in, they can check if he or her is on. If not, they do the assessment and put them in. If you're doing street outreach, you check, is that person on there? If not, you put them in the system. And then same thing, when people get permanent housing, you take them off the system. And we've got a lot of materials around how to do that, and best practices. Some are really sophisticated, and some are done manually, and you can find sort of the right size for you.
Yeah, and just to add to that, you might be doing something like a registry week annually. So you do one, it goes very well, you decide that you want to do it every year after that. So we've seen communities do that. We've seen communities do a registry week every 6 months or at different intervals. But the goal of this work is to choose that common assessment, like Paul mentioned. And so anytime any person who enters homelessness accesses the system, they're given that assessment and then go on the list. So ideally, the ideal situation is that it would be updated in real time as any person enters homelessness. Yes.
Two questions. First question is, if you put data in the Google document,
If you put the data in the Google document, is it legally?
property of Google, the data.
Yeah, so it is, Google has some very specific language in Europe about it, and it is not. They do not have access to the data. They can, if you need to. In some places, you have to show that the cloud is based in your country, and they can do that. But you know, they do have a statement, Google Europe, about do they own versus anyone else. It's the same of almost any either internet or cloud-based system. They are not the owners of the data, but there is a statement on the Google website about that.
And the second part was, how much can you explain, or do you explain to the interviewees about what you will do with the data, who will access to the data? Because I can imagine that there are concerns. You will get.
Yes, so the question is, how much of the process in terms of data collection and storage do you share with the client that you're interviewing? And the response easily is all of it. So prior to going out and sitting down with that person, you would want to know exactly which entities and stakeholders in your community are going to have access to the data. The reason you would do that is because in the consent form, you'll want to include the names of all the agencies that might have the information on that person. And then as well as that, you'll say to them, we're using this data. Oh, yes, here it is. That you'll want to discuss that you're collecting personal information so that you have their name and that it's associated with parts of the VI SCADAT or whatever common assessment, so their history, their risk factors. You want to talk about where the data will be stored. Are you putting it in the Google cloud-based platform? Do you have a different storage system in your community? So you'll need to give them that information as well. You'll also be giving them what the data will be used for. So the data is used for, at sort of a macro level, kind of catch-all statement, planning for housing and resources in your community. If, as you're working on your registry week, other elements of this emerge that you want to use that data for, you need to be sure to include them. So we talk about informed consent, and informed consent is exactly that. Anything that you are going to be doing with the data, any place that you're going to be putting it, and any person that's going to have access to it, has to be communicated to the person that you're going to be talking to so that they can truly decide yes or no, I agree to give my information to this. It's a great question. Yes?
When implementing the Housing First project, evaluation is a very important focus. And I don't know if Registry Week includes some evaluation indicator just to know what's happening with the people. For example, if you have one homeless person in the list every month, it could tell you that something is wrong and maybe in his process is not going well. So could you tell something about that? Thank you.
Yes, so the question is, especially a living registry week list, how can or should you use the data? And in the United States, when people are using the registry week and keeping it up to date, they find, for example, that CAT has been, chronically homeless. She's been on the streets. Every week when we pass by, she's still there. And she hasn't been assigned a caseworker, so no one's been working with her. So let's assign her. So often, communities do something called case conferencing, where they go over people who are very vulnerable or high acuity, and who haven't been working with someone or who are not yet in housing, and really use that to prioritize how they work. And then we've developed a more sophisticated system called HomeLink that really is the next level of technology. But even with the Google form and spreadsheet, people have been able to do really good case conferencing, and in addition to assigning a caseworker to Kat, they can make sure that not two people are working with Kat. So Andy's from a different organization than you are, you're both working and didn't even know that you're both working with the same one. So you can also make sure that there's not duplication of resources.
And in terms of evaluation, so it's typically community by community. You're focused on housing first right now, and you want to see whether or not your program is working. That's something that you could build in if you want to. It isn't necessarily baked into the Registry Week methodology, but we've seen communities do that as well. And if you're doing an aggregate level analysis, that's one thing. If you're going to be including that individual data in the evaluation, then you're going to have to include that in the consent form as well. Yes?
How did you select the community? How did you start the cooperation with the community? And was there any community which refused to participate?
Oh, Sherry.
So we did have slightly over 200 communities join the 100,000 Homes campaign, but 186 did Registry Weeks or had an existing way to have a by name list. So there are some communities that, for one reason or another, decide not to. The two reasons we mostly hear are, we care about client confidentiality. That, we say, is a red herring. That isn't a real one. There is a way with the client's consent to have this information. The other one really is something to consider. And they say, we don't have enough resources to house everybody that we will come across. And I can say that out of the 186 communities, or more than that in the United States now that have done it, not a single one can offer housing to everyone at the beginning. So it definitely is a concern, and it is something that we need to address, but it needn't stop you. And I think the same in Canada and Australia. But that really is something that we can address, and I think we have some guidance on how do you talk to people, that you're giving them an assessment. You're not saying for certain that I'm going to house you tomorrow, but that you are going to use this information to help develop a better housing system for Renault or for your community. Other questions? I like this. Keep it coming. Keep it coming. Stefan, don't tease me. I thought you were raising your hand. All right. I think we're going to turn it over to Mark. So Mark is going to give you a completely different, well, maybe not so different, taste of data from the perspective of London in the United Kingdom.
I wasn't expecting it to be this formal. I was told it was a chat.
It's a chat. It is a chat.
And I was told that, well, I thought we'd be in a room of about 20 people. So, yeah, I've been done, I think, is the thing. London has a database, and it has had a database for a very, very long time. And it is a by name list database.